if you want to talk about Bill Gates, like the first thing he did before that even happened, before the internet even got big, is I believe it was Dell was trying to sell PCs with Linux pre-installed instead of Windows.
Whoa!
So Linux would have had like a decent market share and gotten a lot more momentum than it got as a desktop operating system. What Bill Gates did is he basically he did some sort of deal. I don't know the details precisely, but it was something about like, unless you're exclusive Microsoft Windows on your PCs that you're shipping, you're going to pay a lot more per license. So Dell would pay like, $5 a license or something for Windows, and it would have been $10 or something if they kept selling Linux machines.
So Linux is awesome. For those that aren't familiar, it's open source free operating system that works really, really well. I guess because it's Linux, most people would recognize it because it's similar to Mac OS, right?
Mac OS was derived from a Unix. It was derived more from FreeBSD, which is Unix. Hard to tell the difference, really.
But for all of you out there who use Mac, you might easily understand what Linux is. I think a lot of big chain stores use Linux for their terminals for like self-checkout and stuff because it's free and they'd have to pay licenses. But it's really amazing. I didn't know that story that Bill Gates basically shut that down because imagine if we did not have Microsoft Windows as the dominant platform. Imagine if it was a free open source technology and you get some jerk like Bill Gates who comes in and sticks his foot, in the door and then stops that from happening so he can control that piece. And now you have tech oligarchs like him specifically. And now he's gone from just being some guy who's like, I think you should have my operating system instead to there's too many people on this planet and we should have less people.
Right.
And all of that went, I know, Tim, you bring up antitrust enforcement because that has played sort of a role as a final check here over the decades. It took 10 years of practices like that before finally it was the Internet Explorer integration that finally did trigger that. We've seen far less, antitrust has not provided an effective check in the last bit here on what I think most observers would say is at least somewhat anti-competitive practices among app stores and 100 other things we could go into. I think that the fact is we need something like Fudo because antitrust is not going to handle it on its own. There are things that inherent in the system as it exists now that are anti-competitive that make it, down to the engineers themselves, that this sort of, the model of Silicon Valley now is to lock up talented engineers within 4 or 5 or 6 companies forever. Not based particularly on their output, but based on the fact that them being there prevents viable alternatives from coming into existence.
Now Steve Jobs, I hear he was kind of a dick as well. Was that the case?
Sure. Yeah. I would say like one quality that all these oligarchs, the trait that they have in common is they're all kind of Steve Jobs is maybe special, but if you look at like someone like Mark Zuckerberg, they're mediocre, above average programmers, right? Maybe they're, top 10% programmers. But what the trait they really have is they do like to control things. So like Bill Gates was having a conniption when Dell was trying to sell Linux computers. Mark Zuckerberg was having a conniption when he saw that, tons of people were uploading photos to WhatsApp instead of Facebook, which, within a couple of years that happened.
Wow.
So yeah, so Steve Jobs is the same thing, like very, 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 very controlling people. Like Steve Jobs is like, you must have one. I don't know if you remember. He insisted on one mouse button for a long time, even though there were so many people who wanted like 2 mouse buttons.
Well, there was the gag. I think it was The Onion who made it where the new Mac was just instead of a keyboard, it was a wheel. And if you wanted to type, you had to wheel to the letter and then press the button because it's just simpler that way.
Right.
I couldn't stand Apple. It's the same thing. It's like these people want to control and extract as much as they can from everybody. Yeah. Now, look, good business, good for them, I suppose. But I remember my friends telling me that they were obligated by their professors to buy Mac, to use it for school or whatever. And I'm like, that's 5 times more expensive for the same processing power. They take, what is it, FreeBSD, you said? They take a Unix system, they slap their logo on it, and then charge you money for it.
They did. I'll give them a bit of a pass. They did a lot of good work. And honestly, in 2006, 2007, they were still a very small market share. Like they actually did beat Microsoft by making it better. So I'll give Steve Jobs a pass. If you're the small guy and you're trying to control things, that's okay. If if you have your vision, your unified vision for a beautiful product, and you're at 10% market share, go at it. As soon as you get to have too much power, like 50% market share, and the only other player is also 50%, that's when you gotta step it back a bit.
For sure. I suppose it's fair to say Steve Jobs never came out and said there's too many people, so we got to figure out how to reduce those numbers and population growth, because that's kind of a weird thing for a computer guy to say.
Oh, buying farms and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
What the heck? It kind of makes me think when you have a big network, you kind of want to see what the people want and then build the network to support that, as opposed to build a network that decides what the people are going to want. But that there's so many people that want so many different things, it becomes challenging, if not impossible, to support all those different ideas at once. That might be what's stopping them from why they become so authoritarian and controlling the network. But I haven't been in that position yet, so I'm not sure exactly what's causing it.
To rise to the position where you are running a company like Microsoft, you have to genuinely believe you're smarter and better than everybody. So it's like if you'd take 100 people and you put them in a sieve and you shake it as hard as you can to see what falls out and what sticks, the people who hold on the tightest, they're the ones who have that energy. So naturally, the person who rises to the top at big, massive companies like this are the people who are like, I'm smarter, I'm better, everyone's got to do what I say. That's why you end up with the Bill Gates.
Yeah, and the collusion works. I mean, the collusion works. You're going to win if you're colluding. Somebody who just wants to, likes competition and wants, if they see a threat and they say, well, let's do better, let's view this as a friendly competition, that person's going to lose to the colluders. Yeah. So it's kind of formed naturally, this monopoly in a lot of ways.
And I want to add one more thing to what I was just saying. I was reading about how celebrities tend to be sociopaths. They tend to be narcissists and egotistical, very arrogant. And it's actually fairly simple as to why that is. You have two people. One person is very humble. One person is narcissistic. Which one's going to get up on stage and shout out how beautiful and amazing they are? It's going to be the narcissist. The humble person's going to be like, well, maybe it's not for me. You're going to have someone say, I'd like to audition for this role. And they're going to say, we don't know if you have it. And they're going to go, well, okay, I'll try harder next time. You get the arrogant narcissist guy, and he's going to be like, no, you're wrong. I am the best, and I'm going to prove it to you. And they're like, this guy's got energy. Those people are going to rise to the top. And that's one of the challenges we face, I suppose, with the free market, is that snake oil salesmen, con artists, arrogant narcissists are the ones who end up gaining tons and tons of power. And rarely do you find someone who doesn't have those qualities, but just does a really good job. Or I should say, not rarely, but less often.
I mean, yeah, they get bored, or they feel like they've accomplished something and they just want to go live their life. They don't really care about controlling things, and they've done their thing.
There are a lot of people, many people I follow on Twitter, for instance, and yeah, they do really well, and they're like, well, I did my thing, and I don't want to be the boss, I don't want to be in charge, and they dip out. It's
like the killer instinct, probably is what they call it. That comes from our past, hunting. Like if you didn't have that killer instinct and you couldn't hunt properly, then you would die. And you didn't. But the ones that could hunt and kill their opponents, so that their village didn't get raided and murdered, then they survived. So now there's this killer instinct in business, which is like, maybe we're doing it wrong. That's why I'm doing free software anyway. I think it's wrong. I don't understand locking down all the money. It doesn't make sense.
I always go back to culture is the most important. If as a culture people were into open source and Linux and stuff, Bill Gates would lose all his power and he'd be like the Wicked Witch of the West melting. Like, people adopting Linux across the board would be incredible for that reason.
We got to explain it. You said Graphene OS. So you get an Android phone, you flash Graphene OS onto it, which basically means you erase the operating system and reinstall a new one, which is an open source software called Graphene OS.
Right. It's this guy Daniel McKay is doing Graphene OS, and there's a few other groups doing similar things with the Android open source project. These things, we have to understand, we need to make these things better before we're going to get tens of millions of people using them, which is what I want there to be. I want there to be hundreds of millions of people using software that is not locked down by the oligopoly.
How do you do it? How do you flash a new software operating system on your phone?
I just did it. It was not easy. I bought the phone they told me to buy. It turned out that it was locked down at some point in the history of the phone because it was refurbished. So I had to get another phone. You go through you can go through the instructions at the Graphene OS site. It's pretty straightforward. Like your grandmother could probably do it, or your mother-in-law could probably do it if she has the right phone. Like, and it's still going to not work as well as you want, though.
It's worth it. I love it. I most of the phones I've had throughout my life, except for iPhone, I can't stand iPhone. I would always put on some either bare bones Android operating system, just gut all of the bloat and the garbage that they put into it, and then just get that base system, or using something like Graphene. There's been a whole bunch throughout the history of Android that are just better, simpler, cleaner, safer, etc.
What are some problems with it? You were saying that sometimes it doesn't work as good. What's a problem with it?
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. I mean, do you have problems with like Uber working with your phones, Tim?
What was that?
Like, does Uber work well with your phone? Like a lot of these. So some of
Uber.
Okay, yeah. So some of these apps that people expect to work won't work.
Especially anything very notification heavy. Those rely on Google's services to work well.
Right.
So is that a monopoly? Google's notification system?
It's not quite a monopoly, but it's one of these things that, as we like to say, that Google software is much more delightful, both for the user and the developer. There's a long way to come in that. That's not a slight against Graphene or any of these other groups. They're doing fantastic work.
I've been using Windows since 93 or 92, Windows 3.1. And it's because of video games. I use Steam, and I couldn't game on Linux for like late 90s, early 2000s. I
mean, Valve is doing a lot of great work trying to make Linux work well for games. And I think that, like, I'm a gamer. Like I started out doing games for Yahoo. So I love what Valve's doing to try to make Linux better for games, but it just does kind of hammer home how difficult this problem is, that Valve is this super, super powerful. I consider them to be like one of the better companies that's kind of on the more independent side of things, with Steam being so popular. They have not been able to deliver a successful Linux product yet. They're trying now with the Steam Deck. Hopefully that works.
Thanks for checking out this segment from the Timcast IRL podcast. But if you want to check out the full show live, tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And if you want more special access content, head over to timcast.com and become a member. Your membership helps sustain this company, keep our journalists employed, makes this show happen, and you will get access to exclusive members-only segments of the Timcast IRL podcast, and there's a massive library to check out. So again, go to timcast.com or tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., and we'll see you all there.